10 True Middle of Nowhere Horror Stories. Story number 1. The Last Gas Station Before the Abyss. It was late in the evening, and the dim light from the gas station barely touched the cracked asphalt that stretched into the dark, empty wilderness. Joe had been driving for hours, passing nothing but dense trees and an occasional rundown farmhouse. He was the last one on the road, the only car on a long stretch of highway. The station looked old, its neon sign flickering weakly as though it were barely hanging on. Joe had run out of gas a few miles back, but the gas station was still open, so he figured he'd be fine. The old man behind the counter was hunched over, his hair as white as the bones of long-dead animals that used to graze the fields around here. He bought the usual, a rusty can of gas, some coffee that could have been a month old, and a pack of stale cigarettes that tasted like wet cardboard. But when Joe reached for his wallet, the old man stopped him. "You don't need to pay for gas here," the old man said, his eyes narrowing, like he'd just remembered something unpleasant. Joe froze, his hand still on his wallet. "What do you mean?" he asked. The old man grinned, his teeth yellow and sharp like they were made of broken glass. "That's the last thing you'll be needing tonight." Joe laughed, figuring the man was just some strange local. But there was something wrong. Something about the way the air seemed to get thicker, colder, almost like it was closing in on him. His skin crawled, his hands chilled, as the reality of the situation hit him like a punch in the gut. This was the only gas station for miles. The woods beyond, they were empty, silent. Nothing but darkness and a smell of something decaying in the air. Joe's mind raced. He had heard stories, whispers from truck drivers at the diner, the way people talked when they thought no one was listening, about strange things that lived in the woods, things that waited for you to get lost, things that made sure you never left. The old man slowly pointed toward the woods, his finger trembling in the dark. "They're waiting for you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Joe's laugh died in his throat. It wasn't funny anymore. Something was wrong. The woods felt alive, watching. He turned and looked back at his truck, but the road was dark now. It felt like it had been swallowed by the night. For a moment, he thought about driving away, just getting back in his truck and leaving. But he knew the road wouldn't take him anywhere. Not anymore. The old man leaned forward over the counter, his yellow eyes gleaming. "You won't leave," he said softly. "They won't let you." And in that moment, Joe understood. The woods weren't waiting for him to find them. They were waiting for him to stay. Forever. Story number 2. The Eyes in the Field. Lena had driven this road 100 times before. It was the quickest route to the neighboring town, just a half-hour trip. Nothing special about it, just a stretch of rural highway lined with trees and the occasional house. But tonight something felt different. The rain started out slow, barely noticeable at first, but it quickly turned into a downpour. It hammered down in sheets, blurring the road ahead. Her windshield wipers worked overtime, but it was like they were fighting a losing battle. The visibility was so bad, Lena could barely see the white lines on the road. That's when she saw them. Out of the corner of her eye, through the rain-soaked glass, a flash of light caught her attention. She turned her head, narrowing her eyes to focus through the storm. And there they were, in the field to her right, just beyond a line of twisted bare trees. Glowing eyes. Too many to count. Hundreds, maybe thousands. They blinked slowly, one after the other like they were all synchronized. Lena slammed on the brakes, her heart racing. The eyes blinked again. They blinked in unison. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed her foot down on the gas pedal, speeding away. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and for a moment, she thought she saw the eyes in the field, moving with her, following her car. Not all of them, just the ones closest to the road, but they were moving. She could feel them, like they were watching her, hungry for something. She made the next turn, sharp and fast, and the eyes were gone. At least, that's what she thought. Lena drove the rest of the way home in a daze, her mind racing, trying to convince herself it was just the storm playing tricks on her. But when she pulled into her driveway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Inside the house, she tried to forget about the eyes. She turned on the lights, made a cup of tea, and settled onto the couch. But when she looked out the kitchen window, she froze. The eyes were there. They were staring at her, glowing faintly in the darkness, like they had never left. In the reflection of the window, they stared back at her, dozens of them, blinking in slow motion. She whipped around, but there was nothing behind her. She rushed to the door, pulling back the curtains and peering into the yard. The backyard was empty. No glowing eyes. Relieved, she thought maybe she had imagined it. But as she went to sit down again, she saw something else. The eyes were under the porch, staring, waiting. Lena felt a chill run through her. She couldn't look away, couldn't make her mind stop racing. She closed the blinds, tried to distract herself, but the eyes, those blinking eyes, kept coming back. And then it happened. Every time she closed her eyes to sleep, there they were, those glowing eyes just behind her eyelids, watching her blink, blink, blink. No matter where she went, they followed. Story number 3. The Lonely Motel. Mark had been driving for hours. The highway seemed endless, and his eyes were starting to get heavy. He needed a quick break, a chance to stretch his legs and maybe catch a few hours of sleep. The sign for the motel appeared like a relief. Flickering neon lights in the distance, advertising rooms available. It looked old, but that didn't matter. It was just a stop for the night. When he walked into the office, he was greeted by an odd man behind the counter. Tall and thin, his skin pale, with eyes that were way too wide, like he was always staring at something just out of view. The man's hands trembled slightly as he handed Mark the key to room 7. Room 7, the clerk rasped. They don't check you out until you're gone for good. Mark gave him a confused smile but didn't say anything. He was too tired to think much about it. He just wanted to get to his room, rest, and continue his drive in the morning. He thanked the clerk and walked down the dimly lit hallway, the old carpet muffling his footsteps. As soon as he entered the room, Mark felt something. It wasn't visible, but it was there. A weight in the air, something thick and suffocating. The room was cramped, dim, and smelled like old cigarettes. The fluorescent lights buzzed above him, flickering every few seconds. He dropped his bag on the bed and collapsed onto the mattress. The springs creaked beneath him, but it wasn't the bed that made him uneasy. It was the silence. Except it wasn't quite silent. There was a sound, soft but persistent. Scratching. It was coming from somewhere just out of sight, like nails dragging across wood. Mark tried to ignore it. He tried to convince himself it was just the old building settling, but it wouldn't stop. It was growing louder, closer. And then he heard something else. Whispers. Low, quiet, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. They were coming from the corners of the room. He sat up, staring at the shadows, but the room was empty. The whispers faded in and out, like they were taunting him, but Mark couldn't understand the words. The air grew colder. The temperature dropped, and he pulled the covers tighter around himself. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, the whispers grew louder. The scratching never stopped. It was like the walls were moving, breathing, shifting around him. Mark's heart started to race. He was too afraid to move, too afraid to leave. He finally managed to fall asleep, but when morning came, the nightmare didn't end. Mark tried to leave. He grabbed his bag and walked to the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. He tried again, harder this time, but it was stuck. The window, sealed shut. There was no way out. He could feel the walls closing in around him, breathing, pulsing, like they were alive. The room felt different now. The presence was stronger. Mark couldn't explain it, but it was as if the walls themselves were holding him prisoner. He realized what the clerk had meant. He wasn't leaving. Not unless it let him. And he wasn't sure if it ever would. Story number 4. The Blackened Tree. Clara liked to take the long way home. There was something peaceful about driving down quiet, winding dirt roads, passing through sleepy little towns where nothing ever really happened. But today was different. She hadn't planned on taking this detour. The sign on the side of the road read, "Dead Man's Pass," but she thought it was just one of those weird, spooky things small towns put up for fun. A joke. It didn't really mean anything. Or at least, that's what she told herself. Until she saw the tree. It wasn't big or impressive, just a small tree standing alone in the middle of a wide, empty field. But the thing that made Clara stop was the way the tree looked. Its bark was blackened, as if it had been burned by fire, but the fire had never fully burned out. The charred marks were deep, like scars that never healed. But what really made her stomach twist was the shadows. The shadows under the tree were too dark, too thick. They stretched out beneath the tree, swallowing up the ground around it, almost like something was hiding in them, waiting. Clara's instincts screamed at her to drive away, to just keep going, but she couldn't. She stopped the car and got out. The night air felt colder now, and the road seemed to stretch out longer behind her, like she had left the world behind. She walked closer to the tree, her feet crunching on the grass. The shadows grew longer the closer she got. When she reached the tree, she felt it. Something cold and hard wrapping around her ankle. It wasn't the earth, not really. It felt like twisted roots, rough and alive, gripping her leg and pulling her down. And then, the whispers started. Soft at first, like a breeze brushing through the leaves. But they weren't leaves, they were voices. Leave now, or stay forever. Clara's heart raced. Her breath caught in her throat. She yanked her foot free, stumbling backward. The roots seemed to follow her, reaching out, wanting to hold her in place. She ran. She didn't look back. The field stretched on forever. The road seemed farther away than it should have been, as though the distance between her and her car was growing longer with every step. She ran and ran, but she wasn't sure if she was getting any closer to the road, or if she was even running in the right direction. Clara never spoke about that night again. She never told anyone what happened at Dead Man's Pass. But when she drives home now, she always takes the long way. And she never, ever looks at the trees the same way again. Story number 5. The Unseen Neighbors. Caleb had always liked the idea of getting away from the city. When he inherited a cabin deep in the woods from a distant relative, he thought it would be the perfect weekend retreat. A quiet place to escape the noise and the chaos. He figured it would be nice to spend a few days alone, surrounded by nature with no one around for miles. But when he arrived, he realized just how isolated the cabin really was. The nearest neighbor was miles away. For miles, it was nothing but dense forest, and the only signs of life were the occasional squirrel or deer darting across the path. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. The first night, Caleb had just gotten settled in. The cabin was old, but it had character. He lit a fire, made some dinner, and relaxed in the warmth of the flickering flames. Everything seemed perfect. But then, around midnight, he was woken by a sound. Soft knocking at the door. It wasn't loud or urgent, just slow, deliberate raps, like someone was standing on the other side, waiting. Confused, Caleb got out of bed and opened the door. No one was there. He stood in the doorway, looking into the dark woods, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone around. He closed the door and tried to go back to sleep. The knocking didn't stop. It came again, this time from the windows, then from the roof, and then the walls. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, like someone counting the beats of a song. Soft, steady knocks, one after another. Caleb's heart raced. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just the house settling. But it felt wrong, like something was watching him, waiting. The next morning, Caleb decided to shake it off. Maybe he was just overreacting. He stepped outside to get some fresh air and decided to explore the woods a little. As he wandered, he noticed something strange. In the middle of the forest, standing alone and out of place, was a weathered wooden post. It was old, covered in moss, and had no reason to be there. It stood silently, like it had been waiting for him. Caleb stepped closer, curious, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. That's when he heard it again, the knocking. But this time, it wasn't coming from the cabin. It was coming from deeper in the woods. The sound was louder now, closer. Caleb froze, his eyes darting around, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then he heard it. A voice. Barely a whisper, too quiet to fully understand. But it said one thing. Stay inside. It was strange. It didn't sound like anyone he knew. It felt wrong. Caleb didn't know why, but something inside him told him to listen. But he didn't. He kept moving. And that was the last time anyone heard from Caleb. The cabin stood empty. The knocking never stopped. And sometimes, late at night, people passing through the woods could hear it too. Soft, rhythmic knocking echoing from the trees. Story number 6, The Man in the Road. Charlie had been driving for what felt like forever. His fuel gauge was barely above empty, and the last gas station he passed was miles back. The road ahead stretched out in front of him like a never-ending ribbon of asphalt, with nothing around but dark, empty fields. Then he saw him. A man standing in the middle of the road. At first, Charlie thought it was just his tired eyes playing tricks on him. But no, there he was, clearly visible, just standing there in the middle of the road. His clothes were torn and ragged, as if they'd been worn for years, and his face was hidden by a shadow. But the strangest part, the man wasn't moving. He wasn't walking or even swaying in the breeze. He just stood there, blocking the road like he was waiting for something, or someone. Charlie honked his horn, the sound echoing through the stillness of the night. The man didn't flinch. He didn't even look in Charlie's direction. He just stood there, unmoving. Heart pounding, Charlie swerved his car, narrowly avoiding the figure. He glanced back in the rearview mirror to see the man, but when he looked, he was gone. Like he had vanished into thin air. Charlie's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as a feeling of unease washed over him. Something didn't feel right. The air felt heavier, as if the whole world had gone still. His breath came in short bursts as he pulled over to the side of the road, trying to calm down. Maybe he was just exhausted. Maybe it was nothing. But that's when he saw it. A sign. He hadn't noticed it before, hidden in the dark at the side of the road. It was old, weathered, with faded letters. It read, "Welcome to Hell's End." Beneath it, in fresh white paint, were words that hadn't been there a moment ago. "Turn around before it's too late." Charlie's heart raced. The feeling in his gut grew stronger, a cold wave of dread washing over him. His hands were shaking as he looked around, trying to make sense of it. But there was no way back. No way to undo what had just happened. He never made it home. The road was empty when morning came. No sign of the man, no sign of the sign. Just a long stretch of empty road and the feeling that something, somewhere, had shifted. Story number 7, The Whispering Pines. Emily needed a break. The noise, the people, the chaos of city life. It was all too much. So when she found a cabin deep in the woods, she thought it would be the perfect escape. A place to relax, to be alone, to recharge. But as soon as she arrived, something felt wrong. The trees were too close, the shadows too dark. The quiet was almost suffocating. The cabin was small, old and cozy enough, but the feeling in the air was off. It was like the woods were watching her, waiting for something. Her first night was uneventful, though. She stayed inside, reading a book by the fireplace, trying to ignore the creeping unease in her chest. She fell asleep easily, the sound of the wind in the trees lulling her into a restless sleep. When morning came, things were different. Emily woke to a strange sound. It wasn't the wind like she thought at first. It was a whisper. Soft, faint, but clear enough to hear. The pines surrounding the cabin were swaying, but it wasn't the wind pushing them. No, the trees were whispering. At first, she tried to ignore it. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was her imagination. But then she heard it again, clearer this time. "Emily!" She froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She stood up and looked around, but there was no one. The woods were still, the trees were still. The sound was coming from everywhere. She stepped outside, the ground cold beneath her feet. She walked slowly toward the trees, drawn by the sound, her heart pounding louder with each step. The whispering grew louder, closer. It wasn't just the trees anymore. It was the ground beneath her calling her name. "Help us, help us, help us." Her legs went weak. She dropped to her knees, her hands pressing into the earth. It was warm, too warm. She tried to pull her hands away, but they stuck to the ground, like something was pulling her deeper. And then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, getting closer. She turned her head, but no one was there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and she could feel them behind her, just out of sight. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't move. The air around her grew heavier. The whispering didn't stop. It was everywhere now, swirling around her, filling her head. "Help us! Help us!" Emily couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The footsteps were right behind her, but when she turned around there was nothing. Just the trees, standing silent, watching. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The trees whispered her name again, and then everything went dark. Story number 8, The Lantern Man. Jason had been driving all night, the road stretching on endlessly ahead of him. The fog had rolled in thick, swallowing up the headlights of his truck and making it hard to see anything. He was tired, and the monotony of the drive was starting to get to him. That's when he saw it. A speck of light in the distance. Just a flicker at first, barely noticeable through the fog, but it was enough to guide him through the darkness. A lantern. He pulled over, hoping to get directions, maybe ask the person holding the lantern if he was close to a town or somewhere he could stop for a break. As Jason stepped out of his truck, he saw the man. He was standing in the middle of the road, holding the lantern high, the light casting an eerie glow that obscured his face. But it was his posture that caught Jason's attention. The man was unnaturally still, like he was waiting for something, or someone. Jason called out, but the man didn't respond. He didn't move, didn't even acknowledge Jason's presence. He just stood there like a statue, the lantern glowing faintly in the thick fog. Jason took a few steps forward, trying to get a better look. The closer he got, the more uneasy he felt. Something wasn't right. That's when he noticed the man's feet. They weren't touching the ground. The man was hovering. His legs were twisted, bent at odd angles, as if they didn't quite belong. And as Jason's eyes moved upward, he saw the man's face. Hollow, empty eyes staring back at him. There was no life behind them, just an emptiness that sent a chill through Jason's spine. His heart raced. He turned and ran back to his truck, slamming the door behind him. He started the engine, his hands shaking as he pressed the gas pedal and sped away. But as Jason glanced in the rearview mirror, his breath caught in his throat. The lantern light was there. It wasn't far behind him. It was growing brighter, closer, and it never stopped following him. No matter how fast he drove, no matter how many turns he took, the lantern light remained. Always just behind him. Always getting closer. Jason didn't stop driving. He didn't dare look back again. Story number 9. The Visitor at Dawn. Mia had always dreamed of finding a place where she could be alone, away from the noise and the chaos of the world. So when she found the small cabin in the hills, surrounded by a thick, quiet forest, it felt perfect. It was isolated, peaceful, just what she needed. No one ever came up here, and that was exactly how she liked it. For the first few days, everything was exactly how she imagined it would be. Mia spent her time reading, cooking simple meals, and enjoying the silence. The cabin was small but cozy, and the woods outside seemed endless. It felt like she had finally found a little slice of peace. But one morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise, everything changed. Mia was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, enjoying the crisp morning air, when she noticed him. A man, standing at the edge of the porch, watching her. His eyes were empty, hollow, like there was nothing behind them. He wore a tattered coat that hung loosely around his body, and his face was pale. Too pale. It looked like he hadn't been alive for weeks. "Who are you?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. But the man didn't answer. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, staring at her with those lifeless eyes. She felt a chill run through her, but she couldn't look away. For what felt like forever, they just stared at each other. Then, without saying a word, the man turned and walked away into the trees. Mia didn't know what to do. She didn't feel safe anymore. She quickly went inside, grabbed her phone, and tried to call someone, anyone. But when she looked back out the window, he was gone. There was no sign of him. The rest of the day was a blur. Mia locked all the doors and windows that night, just to feel a little safer. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the image of his empty stare. But when she woke up the next morning, something was wrong. She went into the bathroom and looked into the mirror. Her reflection wasn't hers. The face staring back at her was pale, her eyes empty and hollow. It was the face of the man. Mia didn't know if she was awake or still dreaming, but she knew one thing for sure. The man hadn't left. He was still there, inside her. Story number 10. The Unfinished House. Rick had been driving for hours. He wasn't sure where he was anymore, or which direction he was headed. The road had been empty for what felt like forever, with nothing but trees and empty fields on either side. He was tired, and the endless drive was starting to mess with his mind. Then, he saw it. A house, standing alone on a hill in the distance. It wasn't on any map, and it definitely wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find out here. But Rick didn't think twice. He needed a break, a chance to stretch his legs. When he pulled up, he saw how massive the house was. It looked more like a mansion, but it was unfinished. The second floor wasn't done, and some of the windows were broken. The whole place had a strange, abandoned feel to it. But Rick wasn't about to keep driving when he needed a rest, so he decided to stop. The door creaked as he pushed it open. It felt strange, like the house was inviting him inside. The moment he stepped in, Rick felt a shiver crawl down his spine. The rooms were empty, no furniture, no signs of life. But something was off. It felt like someone had just left, like they might be back any minute. He wandered through the halls, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. That's when he found it. A room near the back of the house. The walls were covered in strange drawings, figures, all with hollow eyes. The figures were staring directly at him, their eyes following him as he moved. It was unsettling, like they were alive. Rick tried to leave, but before he could, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, panic rising in his chest. He grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat felt tight, like someone was choking him from the inside. The walls. Rick could swear they were moving. The drawings, the figures, their hollow eyes. Everything seemed to shift, like the house was alive. He couldn't breathe. His heart pounded in his chest. And then, the whispering started. "You're just like us now." Rick froze. He didn't understand. He didn't know what was happening, but the fear hit him harder than anything he had ever felt before. The walls kept moving. The eyes never stopped watching. And then, everything went dark.